First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me here today. And as you know, I will talk about my book, 18-6, Kamrater inte vänner. And for you who hadn't read the book, it's mainly based on interviews with around 30 former members from Revolutionära Fronten, but also contains like some protocols and articles conducted by RF. And I would like to start off telling you why I chose to write this book. And mainly the thing was that I think that RF is an important part of Swedish Antifa history and as well as working class history in Sweden. And a big part of that is their, in my opinion, their collective identity. And I will get back to this later on in the presentation, as it was a big thing in RF. And if you have any questions during the presentation, just feel free to ask. Okay, so during this presentation, I will talk about when RF was founded. I will talk about how RF were organizing themselves during the first years. Then I will talk about the collective identity, some changes somewhere around 2009. And at last, I will talk about when RF was expanded. But first, I will actually talk about the time before RF was founded. And in the book, I have this short background to the political climate or the political changes in Sweden during the 90s. And very short explained, this was a time when the right wing won the parliament election in 92. And during the time within the parliament, they broke down a lot of Sweden's social backbone. So you could say they butchered a lot of hospitals, schools, social places for kids and youths, living areas, and so on. And this kind of politics, as you know, often get aired to the fascist movement. And therefore, we also had a big problem with fascists, mainly in the streets during the 90s. And I think the fascists also had a big upswing with the skinhead culture. And in some areas where the fascists used to gather was even considered dangerous to be if you didn't fit in the Nazi standards of a human being. And I also want to take the time to mention that they in 1999 also killed Björn Söderberg. And for you who doesn't know who Björn was, he was an active syndicalist who was shot outside of his home in the south part of Stockholm by a Nazi. Okay, so this was a very short brief of the 90s in Sweden. And if we move forward to 2000 and 2001, some youths in Gothenburg and Örebro, which is located on the west side of Sweden, they began to feel really tired of the fascists in their neighborhoods. But they were also tired of feeling that the autonomous movement didn't really accept them, as they felt like the big part of the movement had become some sort of subculture movement. And if you didn't dress or talked or behaved or didn't knew about sort of things, you were maybe questioned or not really fitting in the movement. And actually these kids, they felt like they, as working class kids, didn't really was accepted in the movement. And after a while, even if some of them have been a part of anti-fascist action and the syndicalist and the communist youth organization and so on, they felt like they didn't have any choice but to do something on their own. And RF was the result of realizing that. And during the first time of Revolutionära Fronten as an organization, the basic activism was basically to confront and beat the fascists in the streets, in the neighborhoods, and also in the city areas. And they already had a lot of experience of violence, as they already had confronting fascists in the neighborhoods, but also as some of them was football hooligans. So in 2004, and that's something like 2 years after ARF became an organization, ARF got a new local group in Stockholm, and in a lot of aspects, these two groups had a lot in common, as in feeling of not really fitting in the subculture part of the movement. These youths, both in Gothenburg and Stockholm, they were mainly working class kids. And they often were used to violence, as this was a part of the upbringing in their neighborhoods. And they maybe dressed or talked or behaved differently from the rest of the movement. And therefore they felt like they didn't, they're different from the other part of the movement. They felt like the movement were mainly like middle-class people, and that these people wanted them to adapt to this kind of culture if they should be doing politics. But of course, also these two groups had in common that they wanted to get rid of the fascists in the streets. But one thing actually different the two groups, and that was that the group in Gothenburg and Örebro, they were mainly communists, and in Stockholm they were mainly anarchists. But this didn't seem as a bigger problem, as they had a common enemy, which was capitalism and in the extent fascism. Okay, so a lot of their basic activism was still to patrol the streets, to look in places where they knew that fascists would gather. And RF made a point from the start to use more violence than a common Antifa activist, as a part of a strategy to making the fascists afraid and not feeling safe to gather in public areas. And therefore they used to say anytime, anyhow, anywhere. And this type of saying meant that it didn't matter when, how, when they saw active fascists, they would still confront them. And this also meant if they were fewer in number than the fascists, they would still confront them. And actually RF had this thing during the first years. They had this thing that they actually wanted to confront the fascists in fewer number, because as they would still win the fight, it would make them look more fiercer. So I think you can see that ARF had a huge capacity to inflict a lot of violence, and the goal was basically to that fascists should fear them and that they never should feel safe. And this was an important part of to ARF, because they felt like the fascists didn't have fear the Antifa, so they left enough before, and therefore they could gather in public areas with any problems. So from the beginning, ARF had this outspoken idea of how they wanted the fascists to look upon them. And during interviews, they had talked about, former members had talked about, like, we didn't care if the fascists thought of us as crazy. And I would say that they even wanted them to think they were crazy as like a strategic advantage. And this was also a big part of the propaganda strategy. ARF probably hadn't got that notorious as they got if they didn't have done all the videos. You have probably seen some of them on YouTube and stuff like that. Okay, so now I will try to explain the collective identity that I was talking about in the beginning. And in the book, I have this section where I try to explain a social movement sharing a collective identity that bring the movement together, but also that it gives the movement a common enemy. So the autonomous movement in Sweden, if we understand it as a social movement, therefore should have some sort of collective identity, and a common enemy should be capitalism. But Revolutionära Fronten, who was a part of the autonomous movement, they did have their own collective identity that they didn't share with the rest of the movement. And this own collective identity, I think, is quite special for RF. And in the book, I make this conclusion that RF was built on two legs that formed the organization during all the years. And one of the legs was the threat from the fascists in the streets, and the other leg was the criticism against the autonomous movement. And as I see it, these two legs together become their collective identity. And what makes RF unique within the Swedish Antifa movement, but also in the autonomous movement as well. And Revolutionära Fronten had their own way to talk about their collective identity, even if I think they never talked like in terms of a collective identity. They instead talked about themselves having RF mentality, or that someone was RF material. And this basically made them different from the rest of the movement. And they wanted to be something different as a contrast to the subculture part of the movement. And I have actually tried to translate a little bit from two interviews where the former members talks about the RF mentality. And I think I will read it out loud as well. Well, the RF mentality was about having a class mindset that the rest of the left didn't have at the time. We were the ones who started talking about class. AFA didn't talk about class. SUF didn't talk about class at all. Then we saw that the Nazis, they're a pretty big threat to the working class and an easy target. That's why they became the big focus. And AFA is Anti-Fascist Action, and SUF is the Syndicalist Youths Organization. And the other quote goes like this. If we look at the political side, I think that RF, even though we were socialists like everyone else, had a twist on our language that was very important, as in how we talked about class politics. We made it into reality, which was very good. And no other organization has managed to do so far. But I don't think the reason we managed to organize a certain type of person, I don't actually think it had to do with us talking about politics with that language. I don't think so. I think it was largely about us looking the way we did and behaving the way we did. So this could sum up what the RF mentality was and why they looked upon themselves as different from the rest of the movement. And I want to stress that RF didn't look upon themselves as just being anti-fascist. They mainly looked upon themselves as being working class. And for them, the fascists mainly were working class traders, basically. On the other hand, the autonomous movement had a lot of criticism against Revolutionära Fronten. And basically, if I try to explain that criticism, I think you could say that they looked upon RF as a bunch of young men who liked violence too much, and that it didn't have any further strategy. And I guess RF more resembled of like hooligans, and that they thought that this kind of person didn't belong in the movement. And as said before, RF was very used to violence and had a big violence capacity. But in the same way, they have very clear spoken idea of how they wanted to get rid of the fascists. And so in my opinion, the critic was a little bit unfair as they used their the capacity to inflict a lot of violence into a strategy and to a method. But also the criticism was involving like RF being too macho and maybe like they were using drugs and selling drugs. And I want to talk about this any further, but in the book I have this section where the former members like answer to the criticism. Okay, so far I have been talking about when RF was founded. I have been talking about how RF were organizing themselves during the first years, and just recently I talked about the collective identity. Yeah, and I want to say that in 2007 they got a new local group, and they got another one in 2009. And these two groups, beside the ones, the one in Stockholm and the one in Gothenburg, they were more or less active until RF was expanded in 2015. Yeah. Okay, I will now try to explain how RF tried to adapt to the fact that the fascist wasn't a threat in the streets anymore. And somewhere around 2009, something had changed on the streets. The fascists were not a threat in the streets anymore, as they had been pushed back by anti-fascists. And I say this because a clear majority of the ones I have interviewed, they explain the absence of the fascists in the streets as a result of Antifa activism. And I will talk about home visitations. And in this context, this is basically when anti-fascists make a visit to a fascist home. And this was, I think, in a big part of RF considered like not a useful method. Foremost, I think, because RF want to get rid of the fascists in the streets, but I think also of how they have chosen to organize themselves, and how they have built up their capacity to inflict a lot of violence. However, when the fascists wasn't active in the streets anymore, they considered this as a useful method to maintain their activism. And RF also chose to make this to propaganda once again, as they were always filming the visitation and publish them on the webpage. And once again, they more often than the rest of the movement or the Antifas chose to use more violence during these visitations. Most of this visitation is like when Antifas spray outside of a fascist home or break some windows or maybe cut some car tires. But RF often once again took this a little bit further, and maybe you have seen some of the videos when they go inside of a fascist home and break everything. Yeah, so even if the absence of the fascists in the streets was a good thing to RF, it in the same way did something to the organization. From the beginning, RF and their members were fighters, but during the years as RF grew to be something more than a street group, another type of member become more and more common, and it actually it was more and more common that the member, how would I say, didn't have experiences like a street fight. And for a group as RF who had built their identity on mostly on violence, this did something to the organization. And I would say that this that RF actually they had this identity crisis, and they never like solved this problem. Yeah. Okay. So before I finish this presentation, I will talk a little bit about when RF was dissolved. The media and the police saw the dissolving as a result of repression towards the members. Some years before, some of the members and other Antifas have been sentenced to jail. And I think, of course, this had some with the dissolving, but I don't think that's the whole truth. Revolutionära Fronten was dissolved in September 2015 after some members had written a proposal of them wanting to dissolve the organization, basically because they felt like RF was no longer RF. They felt like RF during the last years had transformed to something else, and that the organization had become more and more common, or more like the rest of the autonomous movement, and that the organization therefore had lost what was special for RF. And they even thought that the members didn't even contribute to the organization anymore, and therefore they didn't have the discipline that was required. And I think the proposal had a lot of had a big part in that RF had changed during the years, and that the RF member didn't was the same kind of person as in the 5 to 6 first years. And I will not talk about this any further because this is part of the book where the opinions are very divided among the members. And still today, many members feel like the decision to dissolve was a mistake, actually. And that's all I have.